So now we're on the top of Daf Chaf Amud Beis, and we're telling a story now about Bava ben Buddha, Shalach vehevi kol tzon kedar shebYushalayim ve'midon bazar. Tzon kedar are the tzon, the sheep that were raised by the Bnei Yishmael, our cousins of old. And it's based on a pasuk in Breshis, v'tzonam shel Bnei Kedar haya muvchar. These were the best sheep. The Bnei Yishmael knew how to raise the sheep properly. And he took these Aftamim sheep and he brought them into the Azara, or at least to the Harabayas, a whole discussion about that, because we don't bring Chulin into the Azara. So right now they still have the status of Chulin until he was Magdish them. So he brought them onto the Harabayas. The Omar, and he made a public declaration, free of charge. Kol Misharotza Lismov, Yomi Yismo. Anyone who wants to come and dedicate an animal, one of this outstanding, beautiful tzon, as a carbon olas re'iyah, can come free of charge, do tzmicha, and will bring it on the mizbeach. And basically what he was doing, he was straightening out the record over here. We had mistakenly thought that Hillel admitted that Shammai was right, but really it was not so. Hillel was just trying to avoid dissension and machlokas. For the sake of peace, he was Meshana. But this Bava ben Buta knew the truth, that Hillel never conceded to Shammai, and in a machlokas between Hillel and Shammai, we pass like Hillel, and therefore Olas Re'iyah is brought on Yontif. Will be also and al osa yom, because of the power and the authority of Bava ben Buta, Gavra Yadav shel Beis Hillel. Now the Talmid of Beis Hillel had the upper hand. The Kavra halacha kamosan, and they established the halacha that you bring an Olas Re'iyah and you do smicha on Yontif itself. And no one objected. Another story of a Talmud of Beis Hillel. On Yontif he brought his Olas Re'iyah and he wanted to do smicha. Mitzo Talmud Echad miTalmidei Beit Shammai v'Yomer Mazu smicha. What are you doing over here? Are you relying on Beis Hillel and violating our Rebbe Shammai, Beis Shammai? We disagree. We don't allow you to bring this carbon with smicha on Yontiv. Hamalo. So the Talmud of Beis Hillel responded in the same short form by saying Mazu Shsika. Again, only 3 words. Right? The contender said Mazu Smicha, and he says Mazu Shtika. Meaning, you'd be better off if you were quiet, if you were silent. Shitko ben Azifa, he intended him, the Talmud of Beis Hillel, to give him an Azifa. The Azifa is like an insult. Ve'holachlo. And this Talmud of Beit Shammai packed his bags. He got the message. Now, Abai wants to derive a moral conclusion from this story about how you respond to someone, a person of contention. If a Talmud Chacham is sort of being challenged with what we call divrei riv, words of contention, he should not respond with extra words. He should try to use the same exact number of words as the person who tried to suck him into a debate, a contention, a machlokas. And why? How do I derive this as a bite from the story of the Talmud of Beis Hillel? The Talmud of Beis Hillel said to the Talmud of Beit Shammai, Mazo smicha. I'm sorry. The Talmud of Beit Shammai said to the Talmud of Beis Hillel, Mazo smicha. The Kamahadole and the Talmud of Beis Hillel responded, Mazo shsika. I think what Abai is trying to convey here, if I understand it correctly, is that in a situation where you have to defend yourself against someone who's really trying to put you in your place and insult you and contend against you, if you start going into long harangues and you don't count your words properly, you're going to lose your cool, as we say. You get angry. So to avoid that, the laws of Derech Eretz require of you to be very, very careful and number your words. Now, we're going to speak about Olas Re'i on Yontif. Tanya, we learned in the Beitza, Amar Lehem Beisila Beit Shammai. Olas Re'iyah should certainly be brought on Yontif from a Kal V'chomer. Uma b'makom she'asur litzorech hejot. You're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos for your own purposes, but nevertheless mutar l'gavoah. Right, the Torah says Olas Shabbos b'Shabbatos. So we bring Tmidim, we bring Musafim on Shabbos, and we do malacha for the sake of gavoah. Even though that same malacha, if it was done litzorech hejot, not for the Beis Hamikdash, you'd be chayav misa, you'd be chayav skila. But for the sake of gavoah, you're allowed to do it. You're obligated to do it. Is makom shemutar lehejot. When we get to Yontif and the Torah allows you to do a malacha litzorech ochel nefesh for a hejot, is eino din shemutar legavoah. How much more so would the Torah allow malacha for the sake of gavoah? If on Shabbos, where the Torah prohibits malacha for the sake of hejot, it permits it for the sake of gavoah. So we see that the Torah is more permissible for gavoah than for hejot. Then in Yontif, where the Torah allows malacha for the hejot, which is called ochel nefesh, how much more so litzorech gavoah? Omelem Beit Shammai nidarmu nedavos yochichu. Wait a second, Beis Hillel, how could you make that kal v'chomer? What about nidarmu nedavos? Don't you agree that in the case of nidarim unidavos, we're going to postpone the carbon until after Yontif? And why don't you apply the same logic and the same kal v'chomer and derive the conclusion shemutar that you're allowed to do on Yontif? Meleches ochel nefesh l'tzorech hejot, and therefore we should have said, derive the conclusion logically that how much more so you're allowed to do the malacha of nidarim and nidavos, which is the dark gavoah, and yet also, nevertheless, it's also. Even though it's l'gavoah, the shalmei nidarim and nidavos are l'gavoah. So we see that even though that same action of, let's say, shchita would be allowed for tzorech gavoah, for tzorech hejot, nevertheless, it's prohibited for tzorech gavoah in the case of nidarim and nidavos. So your kal v'chomer is completely smashed with this pircha. Amar lehem Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel respond, that's not a valid pircha. Mal in nidarim and nidavos she'ein kavu lem zman. Tomer b'yolos re'iyah she'kavu lem zman. My kal v'chomer was only to derive a heter when the carbon is generated by the yontif. And if the yontif allows me to do malacha l'tzorech hejot, how much more so would the yontif, when it generates a carbon, in a case of olas re'iyah, which is a chova, certainly that would be allowed on yontif. If you'll bring me a proof from nidarim and nidavos, what does nidarim and nidavos have to do with yontif? Yontif doesn't generate the neder nidava. The neder nidava is 365 days out of the year. So in Yiddish we say by the mitpolitzes. Probably that's Polish, I don't know, but that's how I was raised. You're comparing apples and oranges. Beit Shammai don't give up the ship, the battle. Amar lehem Beit Shammai, Afazu, even olas re'iyah, ein kavul azman. It doesn't have a kvius of zman, which would limit it to the regel. and you have the Chol Hamoed period. So as far as Yontif is concerned, you want to bring an Olas Re'iyah on Yontif under the claim that Kavul Emzman, that carbon is generated, its obligation is generated by Yontif. That's not so. You could bring the Olas Re'iyah on the Chol Hamoed. Disnan, Mishnah on Daf Tes and Masechet Chagiga with regard to Shalmei Chagiga. Mi Shelo Chag. Somebody did not bring his carbon Shalmei Chagiga b'Yontif Rishon Shel Chag. Chogeg v'holech kol haregel kula. He has the entire regel, all the balance, the 6-day balance, to bring his Chagiga. So we see that Shalmei Chagiga can be brought anytime during the 7 days of Yontif. And even the Yontif Achar Shel Chag, you could even bring your Shalmei Chagiga on Shmini Atzeres. So if the Zman of carbon Shalmei Chagiga is stretched out to encompass the entire regel, that let's derive the conclusion that Olas Re'iyah, which is also a Chovas HaRegel, like Chagiga, encompasses the entire 7 days of the regel. And that puts Olas Re'iyah in the same category as the Dominant Dominus, as far as the Yontif Rishon itself, because it's not Kavul Emzman. You're okay to bring the Olas Re'iyah on Chol Hamoed. Now here, my friends, this Gemara that we just learned, for your edification and mine, is very difficult, because the halach of Shalmei Chagiga, that you could bring the Shalmei Chagiga for the entire balance of the regel, that's not the original and the perfect ideal way of fulfilling your obligation of Shalmei Chagiga. There's a halach of Tashlumin. Tashlumin means if you miss the time period, we give you a little bit of an extension, and we extend it during the entire Chag. So it's a little bit strange that Beit Shammai are building their case on Tashlumin. He writes here in the footnote, "V'ein lo mit Shalmei Chagiga shar yomim einam nechshavim zman hakrov el vak tashlumin till yom rishon ki atashlumin einam el b'zman haroy lakrov." Okay, so now he's getting into lumdus, that even tashlumin requires a zman hakrov. So you see that the zman hakrov of Shalmei Chagiga is 7 days, and therefore, by analogy, the zman hakrov of Olas Re'iyah is also 7 days. Amar lehem Beis Hillel, Afzu, even this Olas Re'iyah Kavul Azman, this time we learned to the Mishnah of our regel v'lo chag, Eino chayav b'achar yusa. The Mishnah is addressing the case of someone who didn't bring his karbanos during the regel, and the Mishnah establishes that Eino chayav b'achar yusa. In other words, he's not obligated to bring the carbon after the regel, and there's no tashlumin after the regel. Now, Olas Re'iyah, since it cannot be brought after the regel, therefore we have an urgency to bring the Olas Re'iyah at that first opportune moment, because otherwise, if we allow him to delay the Olas Re'iyah, he may delay it during the entire week of Sukkot plus Shmini Atzeres, and it'll be too late to bring the Olas Re'iyah. He'll lose the mitzvah of Olas Re'iyah. So therefore, we have to worry about a situation where a person, either out of neglect or maybe mitigating circumstances beyond his control, he won't bring the Olas Re'iyah before the latest time that's possible, which means the end of Yontif. We can't play games with that. Therefore, there's an urgency, says Beis Hillel, in bringing the Olas Re'iyah on Yontif itself. So now Beis Shammai, okay, we didn't succeed in logically refuting Beis Hillel, but let's try to refute Beis Hillel from a pasuk. Amulehem Beit Shammai alokvar nemar. The Torah says, "Ach asher ye'achol chol nefesh u'levaliyosa lachem." Let's emphasize the word lachem. Lachem v'lo legavoa. The Torah only permitted malacha lachem for the purpose of your achila, but not for the achila of gava. And therefore, we're not going to allow you to bring the olas re'iyah on yantiv. It's lachem v'lo legava. Just like we said, nidarim nidavas are not brought on yantiv. Amar lahem beis Hillel v'lo kvar nemar. You're looking at a pasuk in Parshas Bo, and you're darshaning lachem as a miyut to exclude gava. Let's look at a pasuk in Parshas Emor. In Sefer Vayikra it says v'chagosem oso chag lashem. The word lashem is a ribui. Lashem is coming to be marbek kol dehi lashem. Any hakrov on yontif, that's lashem. So the Gemara immediately turns the tables on to Beis Hillel and say, "Cain, according to you, Beis Hillel, matam aloma lachem." Why did the Torah add the word lachem in Parshas Bo? It's a mute. What are you going to exclude? You're not excluding a carbon, so what are you excluding? Lachem v'lo lekusim, lachem v'lo leklavim. You're allowed to shecht an animal for your purposes, but not for a guy, and not for a dog, to feed your dog. Okay. Now the Beitza quotes Abba Shol. Abba Shol is another Tana who disagrees with the Tana Kama, and he has the Kal V'chomer Beis Hillel in a different way in order to derive Olas Riyon Yont. Abba Shol Amra, he has the Kal V'chomer Beis Hillel B'lashon Acheres in a different formulation. Uma b'makom shekirascha sisuma. Kiras Rabba Psucha. This is all a mashal. A kira is a small stove. There's a whole parak in Shabbos called parak kira, as you know. And it has an opening. And you pull out the opening, like a little platform that comes out of a door, and you put two, excuse me, two pots, one on one flame and one on the other, and then you close the door. And your kira is open, meaning you're allowed to put pots on your fire, on your oven, for the sake of ochel nefesh. How much more so kiras rabcha psucha? When it's a carbon that's brought legava, how much more so should we open up and allow you to do whatever you have to do, like in the mashal, the keros, and the bishul, and here all the malachas that are necessary to bring the karbanos. And the Gemara assumes that according to Abba Shol's Kal V'chomer, this includes even nidarim unidavos. Anything that's a tzar kavah is mutter based on this Kal V'chomer. V'chein b'din, it's logical to derive the conclusion that we should be matir malacha l'tzar kavah shelo yeh shulchancha male v'shulchan rabcha reikon. You know, your table is set like a banquet on Yontif. You did all these malachas and all the bishul and all the afiyah and so forth and so on. And take a look at the shulchan, meaning the mizbeach of your Rebbe, of the master of the universe. It's completely empty. Certainly the Torah would be matir to bring karbanos like holos re'iyah, nidarim and nidavis on Yontif. What's the nafkamina between the two formulations, that of the Tanakama and that of Abba Shol? The Gemara starts with Abba Shol. Mar Savar, according to Abba Shol, nidarim and nidavis craven beyond it. With the logic in the Kal V'chomer from kirascha sesuma to kiras rabcha psucha, or, for example, from shulchan chamole to shulchan rabcha mole, we're going to derive the conclusion that according to Beis Hillel, nidarim and nidavis are brought on Yontif. Umar, so, but according to the Tanakama, we will not bring nidarim and nidavis ain craven be Yontif, even according to Beis Hillel. And that's why in the formulation of the Tanakama, when Beit Shammai respond to Beis Hillel, they were able to quote the halachas of nidarim nidavis, because even you, Beis Hillel, agree that we don't bring nidarim nidavis on Yontif. But in the formulation of Abba Shol, Beit Shammai dropped the ball. They didn't even respond to the logical power of the Kal Vachomer of Beis Hillel. What were they going to do? Quote Nidar v'Nedavis. But Beis Hillel hold according to Abba Shaul's formulation that Nidar v'Nedavis are craven beyond. Omer Avhuna l'divrei Omer Nidar v'Nedavis ain't craven beyond. According to that opinion, which was the Tanakama of Beitza, Lo Tema, don't misunderstand and think that Midaraisa Mechse Chazi, that the Torah would allow you to bring Nidarim and Nidavis on Yontif, Durabanan Gazrile, and it was only an Isa Durabanan, Gzeira Shemi Yisheh, because we're afraid that during the course of the year, he's got a backlog of Nidarim and Nidavis, and he's going to postpone them until the Rega. So he doesn't have to go back and forth from Dan to Yerushalayim or Beersheba up to Yerushalayim. And then what's going to happen is we're going to get to the Moed, and he's going to violate the Isur Bal Tiacher. The Torah prohibits you from going past a certain period of time after your Nidava. That's not true. Ella, but rather, if you hold that Ein Nidam and Nidava is craving beyond, that's a Doraisa halacha, filu Doraisa nami lo chazi. As we said before, it's derived from the pasuk lochem v'lo legavoa, and the ribui of Lashem, which Beis Hillel quoted, is only coming to include a carbon that's similar to the Chagiga, which means a carbon that's kavua zman barega like olas re'iyah, but certainly not nidar v'nedavis because ein zmanam kavua barega. And Rav Huna wants to prove this statement that he just made. So on Chag Atzeres, on Shavuos, they bring the Kivsei Atzeres as an accompaniment to Shtei Alechem. And Lekal Migzar Shema Yisher, this is a carbon that only comes once a year on Shavuos. So you're not going to say that he has a backlog of karbonos which he postponed until Shavuos. That doesn't apply at all to Shtei Alechem. And yet, Ein Adocha Lo Sa Shabbos, Lo Sa Yontif. We don't bake Shtei Alechem on Yontif. We have to bake them on Erev Yontif. And the reason is because the Ribui of Lashem only applies to that which is similar to Chagiga, and the Zman of Shchita of the Chagiga is Kavua B'Regel, but the baking of the Shtei Alechem is not Kavua B'Regel. You can do the baking of the Shtei Alechem on Erev Shavuos. And in the case of Nidar and Nidavis, we're not going to include that in the Ribui of Lashem. Why? Because again, it's not Zmanam Kavua. Nidar and Nidavis can be brought any day of the year. And if you would tell me that it's only an Isa Drabanan, then in the case of Shtei Alechem, we don't have the Gzeira of Shemi Yisheh, and therefore we should have allowed you to bake the Shtei Alechem on Shavuos, on Atzeres. So the fact that that's prohibited, you see that we're dealing with the Doraisa, not with the Drabanan. The Drabanan of a Gzeira Shemi Yisheh doesn't have any application whatsoever to Shtei Alechem. Yiboilahu, the Gemara says, Safek, L'divrei Omer Nidar Nidavis ain't craven beyontif. Avar v'shachat mai. We know that the avod of any carbon begins with shchita and ends with zrika. He went ahead and illegally did the shchita on yontif of a neder or a nedava. What about the zrika? There's a lot at stake over here because you have the basa, the carbon that's eaten by Adam, or that part of the bus, or the murim, which has to be brought out, and all that depends upon zrika. So what are you going to do? You're going to freeze the process, arrest zrika, and then the entire enterprise of the carbon is going to go down the tubes. Rava Amar Zorik es Adam. We're going to allow you to be Zorik the Dam. That's a violation of what's called an Isa Shvus. And even though ain't Shvus b'migdash, but in this case where he was in violation of the law, and he shechted a carbon which he shouldn't have been shechted, we're going to apply the principle of Shvus. But Rava says no. We're going to allow and permit the Zrika. Because in the absence of Zrika, we won't be able to eat the basar. Rabba Bar Huna Amar Zorikes Adam al Manas Lachtere Murim La Erev. According to Rabba, as opposed to Rava, we're not going to allow Zrikas Hadam for the sake of Achilas Habasa, Al Yidei Adam, but rather for Achilas Mizbeach, which means Haktorah. Because the Haktorah is going to take place after Yontif, which is fine, because Haktorah always includes the day and the night that follows the day. Ayin Tchila Shas, right? And now we have a situation where without the Zrikas Adam, you won't be able to be Maktir the Emurim, because the halach is that the Zrikas Adam is Maktir the Haktorah Emurim. So Rabbah is saying that for the sake of Haktorah Emurim, we're going to permit the violation of the Shvus of Zrika on Yontif. Now, in my Gemara, he elaborates on a Rashi here, because Rashi says, Kol shkedim abasar kayam, sheyesh bizrika tzarcha chol nefesh. Rabbah is not trying to exclude Rava. Certainly for the sake of being matir the achilas adam of the basar, certainly we would allow you to do the zrika and override the shvus of zrika, because then it becomes ochel nefesh mamish. But Rabbah wants to add another chiddush and extend the heter of zrika, even in a case where there won't be any achilas basar. Let's say the basar got lost, as we'll see in a minute. But nevertheless, for the sake of the emurim, which will be brought on the mizbeach motzei yontif, we're going to allow zrika. My beinayu, ika beinayu, nitma basar osha ava. The basar, the carbon, which is normally eaten, was tamei, became tamei, or it was lost. L'rava lo zarek. There's no matir to override the shvus of zrika because there's no achilas basar. But l'Rav bar Huna zarek. Why? Even though the zrika could not be matir basar, there is no basar to be eaten. But nevertheless, we want to be machshir the murim, faktara on motzei yontif, falayla, and therefore it's mutter on yontif, and we're not going to prohibit it b'shum shvus. Meisvei, the Gemara has a kasha on Rabba bar Huna, Rabba Beitza. The Beitza says kivsei atzeres. These are shalmei tzibur that are brought together as an accompaniment with the shtei lechem on atzeres, and we do the shechita for the purpose of shalmei tzibur on atzeres. But if he shechted it shalol l'shman, shechted not l'shem shlomim, but rather l'shem olah, that was the machshava of the Kohen at the time of the shechita. Oh, alternatively, shechatan lifnei zman or liachar zman, and he did the shechita before atzeres or after atzeres. And the din in all karbanos, if there was a machshava shalol l'shma or shalol b'zmanom, we're not talking about pigul. Pigul is something else. Is then the carbon is kosher, it's nechal, but it's eino ola l'baylam l'shem chov. So hadam yizarek v'abasa yeyocher. Since the carbon is still kosher, therefore we will go ahead and do the zrikas hadam, and we'll eat the basar. The kohanim will eat the basar. And that's the unique halach of Shalmei Atzeres, that even though it's a shlomim, it's only eaten, carbon tzibur, it's only eaten by the kohen. Anyway, M'hoisa Shabbos, now there's an overlap between Shabbos and Shavuos. Lo Yizrok. Why? Because what's going to happen after you do the zrika? You can't eat the meat because you can't do bishul or tzli on Shabbos. So the Gemara assumes now that there's no possibility of eating the basar, and therefore we're not going to allow you to be zorik to dam. And this clearly indicates that the heter to be zorik to dam is based on achilas habasar, not on aktoras haimurim. V'im zorak. If he didn't even ask us for the halacha, he didn't ask the rabbis, he went ahead, he was zorik to dam, which he did shalom kedin against the halacha, because again on Shabbos, that zrika is not going to be mat to the basar. And here we turn to the Afchaf Aleph. Urza. The zrika is considered as zrika kshera, and the carbon is oleh, liratzon, because it has a validity. And now he could be makta the imurim on Motzei Shabbos, not on Shabbos, but on Motzei Shabbos. So now the Gemara asks the kasha from this Beitza. The Beitza says him Zorak. He did this Rika on Shabbos illegally. Hurtza, the carbon is hurtza. Mashma, di'evet in. We would not have allowed him to do this Rika lechatchila, only b'di'evet, but lechatchila lo, he shouldn't be zorked now on Shabbos. Bishleim l'Rava Nicha, I understand according to Rava, since this Rika is not going to be machshir, the achila doesn't set up an achila, because there's no way you could cook or bake the meat on Shabbos. Therefore, there's no heter to do this Rika. It's only b'di'evet if he did this Rika. But El Rabba Bar Avuna Kasha, I don't get it. Why does the Beitza imply that you're not allowed to do this Rika on Shabbos, and you're going to be mocked to the Imurim of Motzei Shabbos? According to Rabba, we're going to allow you to do this Rika to salvage the Aktaras Imurim of Motzei Shabbos. Kasha. Iboy Sema, the Gemara offers another possibility to reconcile this Beitza with Rabba Bar Avuna. Shani Shvus Shabbos Mishvus Yontif, that even though on Yontif will be Mekil and lenient, there will be Matir Shvus for the purpose of Haktorah Seimurim Amotzei Yontif, but on Shabbos we get very, very strict about it. We're not going to be Matir a Shvus of Shabbos, of Zrikas Adam, if it's not part of the carbon of the day. And the Rabban are going to be machmir on Shabbos where they were not machmir on Yontiv. So this is where we're going to stop for today. I mean, it'll take a few hours maybe, but I already taped Chaf Aleph, which is on Yontiv. We can't do that. And you can find it in about an hour or so on YU Torah. And finally, what I'd like to ask